The question hung in the air longer than Meghan expected. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't sharp. There was no accusatory edge to Diane Sawyer's voice when she asked it. That, somehow, made it heavier. Meghan felt the weight of it settle across her chest, the way a held breath does when you realize too late that you've been holding it for too long. For a moment, she didn't answer. The studio remained unchanged, still quiet, still evenly lit, still professionally neutral. But inside Meghan, something had shifted. The careful rhythm she had maintained since the interview began faltered, just slightly. She had entered the room prepared for skepticism disguised as hostility, for interruption, for the kind of blunt dismissal she had learned to parry with practiced poise. What she hadn't fully prepared for was this: calm persistence, precision. Questions that didn't accuse, but also didn't retreat. She straightened in her chair again, smoothing the front of her blazer as if to ground herself in the familiar ritual of composure. Her voice, when it came, was measured, controlled. "No," she said. "I'm saying that trauma doesn't follow a script. It doesn't express itself neatly or consistently, and it certainly doesn't owe anyone clarity. In the way it's described..." Diane listened without interruption. She didn't nod this time. She didn't frown either. She simply held Meghan's gaze, attentive, unflinching, as though giving the words exactly as much space as they deserved, and no more. "I don't disagree," Diane said finally. "Trauma is complex. But when stories are shared publicly, especially repeatedly, they stop living only in the private realm. They enter a shared space. And in that space, language matters." Meghan felt a flicker of irritation rise, sharp and familiar. She had heard variations of this argument before, always framed as concern, always positioned as intellectual curiosity rather than judgment. Still, coming from Diane Sawyer, whose reputation rested on restraint rather than provocation, it felt harder to dismiss. "So what is it you're asking me?" Meghan said. "To simplify my pain, to compress it into something more palatable." Diane shook her head slowly. "I'm asking how you want it understood." The distinction unsettled Meghan more than she expected. She uncrossed her arms, then crossed them again, aware of the camera, aware of how even small movements could be read as defensive or evasive. She had learned that every gesture carried meaning once it was replayed, dissected. Captioned, "I want it understood as real," she said, "as valid." "And do you feel," Diane asked gently, "that disagreement automatically invalidates it?" Meghan's lips parted, then closed again. Her instinct was to answer quickly, decisively, but something in Diane's tone slowed her down. This wasn't a trap. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was an opening, narrow but deliberate. "I feel," Meghan said carefully, "that questioning the way someone articulates trauma often becomes a way of questioning whether that trauma exists at all." Diane considered that. She picked up her pen, not to write, but to hold it loosely between her fingers. "Sometimes," she said. "Other times it's an attempt to understand the full picture, especially when different versions exist side by side." Meghan's jaw tightened. "My experience doesn't need corroboration." "No," Diane agreed. "But public narratives do interact with other narratives. That interaction creates friction. Ignoring that doesn't make it disappear." The room felt warmer now, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Meghan felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes. Not tears. Not yet. But the strain of having to remain composed while something deeper pushed against the surface. "I've been clear about what I went through," she said. "I've shared it because silence nearly destroyed me." "Sharing saved you," Diane said. Double quotes, yes. "Then perhaps," Diane continued, "the next question is whether the story is still serving healing or whether it has become something else." Meghan stiffened. "What else would it be?" Diane met her gaze steadily. "A symbol, a point of reference, source of power both for you and for those responding to it." Power. The word landed sharply. Meghan's shoulders drew back instinctively as though bracing. "I didn't ask for power," she said. "I asked for dignity." "Power and dignity aren't opposites," Diane replied, "but they are often confused." As the silence returned, thicker now, layered with everything unsaid, Meghan became acutely aware of her breathing, of the slight hum of electricity overhead, of the impossibility of retreating without it being noticed. Walking out would be read as defeat. Staying meant continuing down a path she no longer fully controlled. "You're very careful with your questions," Meghan said at last. "I try to be," Diane replied. "Careful questions can still wound." "Yes," Diane said softly. "Can, but they can also reveal where understanding breaks down." Meghan looked away for the briefest moment, then back again. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter now. "I've spent years being misunderstood," she said. "Forgive me if I'm tired of being asked to explain myself yet again." Diane's expression softened, not dramatically, not sentimentally, but enough to register. "Being heard repeatedly doesn't always mean being understood," she said. "But avoiding difficult questions doesn't guarantee understanding either." The camera remained close, intimate. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, no visible rupture. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The interview was no longer about recounting events. It was about ownership of meaning, about who gets to define truth once it enters the public sphere. Meghan sat very still, aware that every word from this point forward would echo far beyond the room. Diane waited, as she always did, trusting silence to do what pressure never could. And in that quiet, Meghan Markle faced not an attack, but something far more unsettling: the possibility that her story, once released into the world, no longer belonged only to her, and that explaining it might require more than repetition. "No," Diane replied evenly. "I'm asking how the audience is meant to interpret it." The words were measured, careful, almost neutral, but Meghan heard the edge beneath them. Her jaw tightened. "My pain isn't a public service announcement," Meghan said. Her tone sharpened, steel wrapped in silk. "It don't exist to make people comfortable with what I went through." Diane didn't react. She didn't rush to reassure or retreat. She simply held the moment, as seasoned interviewers do, letting the silence do part of the work. "Then why return to it so often?" she asked. The question landed like a blade wrapped in velvet, precise. It's elegant and undeniably sharp. Meghan laughed once. It was short, incredulous, almost involuntary, as if the sound escaped before she could stop it. "Because silence protects institutions," she said, leaning forward slightly now, "not people." Diane met her gaze without blinking. "Visibility protects truth," Meghan said immediately, the word crisp, rehearsed, ready. Diane tilted her head just a fraction. "Not skepticism, curiosity." "Whose?" Meghan blinked. For a split second, the rhythm faltered. "Mine." Diane waited. She had perfected the art of waiting, of letting a person hear their own certainty echo back at them. "Only yours?" she asked gently. The air in the room thickened, as if every word now carried weight. The lights felt warmer, the space smaller. Meghan's fingers flexed against the armrest, betraying tension she hadn't meant to show. "I think this line of questioning assumes bad faith," Meghan said carefully. "No," Diane replied. "It assumes complexity." Meghan shook her head, frustration beginning to surface. "Complexity is often used to discredit women. And simplicity," Diane countered without raising her voice, "can erase others." That did it. Voice rose for the first time, not loud, not uncontrolled, but sharp enough to cut. "I'm not responsible for how other people feel about my truth." Diane nodded once. "No, but public narratives rarely belong to one person alone." Meghan's eyes flashed. "So now I'm being told to share ownership of my own life." "I'm suggesting," Diane said calmly, "that when stories involve families, institutions, and nations, they echo." Meghan scoffed, leaning back now, crossing her legs, a reclaiming gesture, deliberate and defensive. "That sounds like a very convenient way to dilute accountability." Diane didn't flinch, or to widen it. There was a pause, a real one this time. "I've noticed something," Meghan said coolly. "When men speak repeatedly about hardship, they're called brave. When women do it, they're questioned." Diane's expression softened, just slightly. "That double standard exists." "Then why perpetuate it?" Meghan pressed. "I'm not," Diane replied. "I'm examining narrative power." Meghan shook her head. Frustration now visible, no longer contained beneath composure. You're dissecting my experience like it's a case study, because you presented it publicly, Diane said gently. And public stories invite public understanding. Meghan's lips pressed together. This feels less like understanding and more like skepticism. Sometimes, Diane said quietly, they look similar. Meghan leaned forward again, eyes intent. I came here expecting fairness, and you have it, Diane replied. Fairness includes difficult questions. Meghan laughed again, louder this time, the sound edged with bitterness. This is exactly why people don't trust the media. Diane raised an eyebrow slightly. Because we ask? Because you frame? Meghan shot back. You control tone, context, what's emphasized and what's dismissed. Diane nodded. That's why I choose words carefully. Meghan gestured vaguely between them, frustration spilling into motion.
Ow.
Then choose better ones. For the first time, Diane didn't respond immediately. She closed her notebook slowly, deliberately, and placed it beside her. The sound of the cover meeting the table felt louder than it should have. Meghan, she said softly, do you believe your story will ever be finished? The question caught Meghan off guard. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't analytical. It was human. I don't know, Meghan said after a beat. Her voice was quieter now, less polished. Healing doesn't have an end date. Diane nodded. Then perhaps the tension isn't about repetition. She paused, letting the idea settle. Perhaps it's about resolution. Meghan's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Masking, Diane said evenly. Whether this story moves forward or circles. The camera pulled slightly tighter. The room seemed to hold its breath. Meghan didn't answer immediately. In that pause, something fragile, something carefully maintained began to crack. Not dramatically, not visibly, but unmistakably. The silence stretched longer than before. Finally, Meghan spoke, but her voice had changed. The certainty was still there, but now it was threaded with fatigue. With the weight of carrying a story that refused to stay contained, I'm still inside. It, she said quietly. And you're asking me to narrate it as if I'm already past it. Diane listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rescue. That, Diane said softly, may be the most honest answer of all. The words slipped out before Meghan could fully temper them. Not angry, not pleading, just tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from repeating yourself. So many times that even your own explanations begin to feel worn thin. Diane Sawyer didn't respond immediately. She didn't contradict the statement or rush to soften it. Instead, she reached for her notebook again, the movement deliberate, unhurried. The soft sound of paper shifting felt unusually loud in the quiet studio. I want to read something, Diane said calmly. Your words, not mine. Meghan's eyes flicked downward for a fraction of a second, then lifted again. Her face remained composed, but something alert stirred beneath the surface. She recognized the moment. This was not accusation, was citation. Go ahead, Meghan, said Diane, adjusted her glasses, scanning the page as though orienting herself. Not just to the text, but to the weight of what she was about to introduce. Interview March, she began. You said, I never wanted attention. I wanted privacy. Meghan nodded once stiffly. The statement was familiar, rehearsed through countless headlines and rebuttals. 2 months later, Diane continued, you said sharing is the only way to break silence. Meghan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but audible. Both can be true. They can, Diane agreed immediately. There was no challenge in her voice, no correction. But the audience hears contradiction. That was the pivot, not a judgmental observation. Somehow that made it harder to deflect. Meghan leaned forward now, elbows resting on her knees. The posture was intimate, almost confessional, but her voice carried a sharper edge. The audience isn't living my life. No, Diane said, but they are listening. The words landed quietly yet firmly. Meghan's jaw tightened. A subtle shift the camera would not miss. This feels like a cross-examination, Meghan said. Diane met her gaze steadily. It's documentation. Meghan let out a short, humorless scoff. That's a convenient word. Diane didn't react. She didn't defend it or redefine it. She simply turned another page. Another quote, she said. Environment as emotionally unsafe. Meghan's fingers curled slightly in her lap, nails pressing into her palm. And yet Diane continued. Thou later described moments of joy, laughter, connection. Are you suggesting, Meghan cut in, her voice firmer now, that abuse must be constant to be real? No, Diane said evenly. I'm suggesting clarity matters. Meghan straightened, reclaiming her posture, her tone sharpening with, This is exactly what people do when they don't want to believe women. Diane paused not to retreat, but to choose her words carefully. Or when they want to understand timelines. Meghan shook her head. You're reducing lived experience into bullet points. I'm placing them in sequence, Diane replied. The silence that followed felt denser than before, layered. With implication, this was no longer about what had happened. It was about how it was being told, and how it was being received. Meghan leaned back, crossing her arms loosely, defensive but still controlled. Life doesn't unfold neatly, she said. Trauma doesn't follow a straight line. I agree, Diane said. But public narratives often ask audiences to follow one. And when they can't, Meghan said, they assume deception. Sometimes, Diane acknowledged. Other times, they assume complexity. Meghan's lips pressed together. She had prepared for skepticism framed as hostility, for dismissive doubt, for cruelty disguised as commentary. Out. What she hadn't prepared for was this. Skepticism framed as patience. As listening, you're asking me to reconcile contradictions that only exist because people want certainty, Meghan said. I'm asking, Diane replied gently, how you want uncertainty to be understood. The question lingered. Meghan looked briefly toward the side of the studio, toward the producers. The crew anywhere but Diane. When she looked back, her voice was quieter. I've spent years trying to explain myself, she said. Every time I do, someone says, I've said too much. Or not enough. Or differently than before. Yes, Diane said softly. That's the cost of speaking publicly. In silence, Meghan countered, was destroying me, I believe. That, Diane said. The affirmation was simple, unembellished. It didn't feel performative, and that unsettled Meghan more than disbelief ever had. But Diane continued, once a story is shared repeatedly, it stops functioning only as testimony. It becomes a reference point. A reference point for what? Meghan asked. For discussions about truth, Diane said. About credibility. About power. There it was again. Power. Meghan's shoulders tensed. I didn't choose this position. No, Diane agreed. But you inhabit it now. The studio lights remained steady, the temperature unchanged. And yet the atmosphere had shifted again, not toward confrontation, but toward something more uncomfortable. Accountability without accusation. I'm not lying, Meghan said, her voice firm. I haven't suggested that, Diane replied. Then what is this? Meghan asked. What are we doing? Diane closed her notebook gently, resting her hands on it. We're examining how stories evolve, she said, and how audiences respond when they do. Meghan sat very still. For the first time, the armor she had brought into the room felt heavy instead of protective. You keep saying audience, Meghan said, as if they're entitled to my coherence. They're entitled to understanding, Diane said. Whether or not they receive it is another matter. The camera held its frame. No music, no dramatics. Just two women in conversation. Defending the right to be believed, the other insisting that belief and inquiry are not enemies. Meghan inhaled slowly. She could feel the familiar pulse urge to retreat, to assert, to reclaim control. But the silence Diane allowed offered no escape. It's only reflection. And in that moment, Meghan realized something unsettling. This interview was no longer about proving pain. It was about navigating what happens after pain becomes public and how. Truth, once shared, must coexist with questions. Not all of them hostile, not all of them kind. Meghan's voice rose, not loud enough to be called shouting, but sharp enough to fracture the stillness of the room. The edge in it surprised even her. She felt it the moment it escaped, that subtle loss of calibration she had worked so carefully to maintain. Diane Sawyer's response came without hesitation, her tone unchanged. Because sequence shows evolution. Meghan let out a short laugh, stripped of humor or inconsistency. Diane tilted her head slightly, studying her not critically, not sympathetically, but with the steady focus of someone unwilling to look away. Which one do you believe it is? The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't designed to corner. That again was what made it dangerous. Meghan stared at her. I believe I've been remarkably patient. Diane didn't smile. Patience doesn't eliminate accountability. The words settled between them like a dropped object neither of them could ignore. Accountability? Meghan repeated, incredulous. For what? For impact, Diane said softly. Meghan leaned back hard into her chair. The movement sudden enough to shift the air around her. So now I'm responsible for how my truth affects institutions that harmed me? I'm asking Diane, replied evenly. Whether the story allows space for other truths. Meghan's eyes flashed. Those others had power. I didn't. And now, Diane asked. The question landed heavier than any before it. Heavier because it didn't accuse, it observed. Meghan opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the interview began, words didn't immediately present themselves. The silence pressed in. I have a platform, she said. Finally, earned through survival. Diane nodded once. Platforms amplify. So does scrutiny, Meghan snapped. Yes, Diane agreed. That's the exchange. Meghan shook her head slowly, disbelief and frustration threading together. This is exactly why I hesitate to sit down like this. And yet you did, Diane said gently. Meghan leaned forward again, her voice colder now, sharper with intention. Because people like you shape perception, whether I show up or not. Diane didn't deny it. That's why this matters. Meghan gestured between them, her hands slicing the air. You're dissecting me as if I'm a concept. Listening to you as a subject? Diane replied. Meghan laughed sharply. That's not how it feels. How does it feel? Diane asked. Meghan didn't answer immediately. Her breath had gone shallow. Her fingers curled against her thigh. Like no answer will ever be enough, she said. Like the goalposts keep moving. Diane paused. Then she closed the notebook again, setting it aside as if deliberately, reducing the distance between them. Then let me ask something simpler. Meghan cut in sharply. By whom? Diane didn't flinch. By you. The studio felt smaller now, tighter, as though the walls had edged inward while no one was looking. Meghan froze. Her mind raced through the familiar defenses clarify. Redirect, reassert, but none of them felt sufficient in this moment. I wouldn't change it, she said at last, because softening truth makes it palatable, and I'm not here to be palatable. Diane nodded slowly, then confrontation becomes inevitable. Meghan's voice sharpened. Are you confronting me? I'm engaging you, Diane replied. There's a difference. Meghan rose halfway from her chair, then stopped herself. Muscles taut, hands clenched as if holding something back. You keep saying engage, she said, but this feels like containment. Diane met her eyes steadily, or reflection. Meghan shook her head. I don't recognize myself in this framing. Sometimes, Diane said quietly, mirrors are uncomfortable. Meghan stared. At her, breathing shallow now, control she'd maintained beginning to strain visibly. This interview, she said carefully, has crossed a line. Diane didn't respond immediately. Waited just long enough for the weight of the statement to settle. Which line? She asked finally. Meghan didn't answer. She looked away. And in that moment, it was clear. The rupture wasn't coming. It was already here. Diane didn't chase her gaze. She didn't prompt or fill the silence. She waited not like a host, waiting for a soundbite, but like a person waiting for a decision. Meghan's eyes drifted around the studio. The small candle behind Diane, unlit but deliberate, The black and white photograph on the cabinet, the neat stack of books that looked impossibly calm given what was happening in the room, everything appeared unchanged, untouched by tension. That, somehow, made it worse. The lights didn't shift. The microphones didn't move. But something in Meghan's posture did like a thread inside her had snapped, and the rest of her was pretending it hadn't. Diane spoke softly. "You said this interview crossed a line?"
Ow.
Meghan's eyes returned to her, sharp again. "Date!" "Did. I want to respect that," Diane said. "But I need to understand where the line is, so people watching can understand it too." Meghan exhaled through her nose, a controlled release. "The line is when my pain becomes a product." Diane nodded once, slowly. "It's fair, Meghan." "And we're there," Meghan said. Diane didn't argue. She let the statement sit, unchallenged, unembellished. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything neither of them said. The interview had reached its quiet breaking point. Not with shouting, not with a walkout, but with recognition that this conversation could not continue. Without changing something fundamental, either the story or the way it was being heard, and neither woman was willing to yield. A small laugh escaped Meghan's lips. It wasn't amused. It wasn't even bitter. It sounded almost startled, as if she'd surprised herself by how unreal the moment felt. "This is absurd." "I'm not saying you caused harm," Diane said, evenly. "I'm asking you to define the standard you want the world to use when it evaluates stories with power attached." Meghan leaned forward, elbows pressing into her knees, her posture suddenly intent, coiled. "I don't accept your premise, Diane." Diane nodded once. "That's an answer." Meghan's voice rose a notch, sharp with frustration. "No, it's not. That's you trying to corner me into admitting I'm responsible for things I didn't do." Diane didn't lift her tone. "I'm trying to understand whether responsibility and victimhood can exist in the same story." Meghan froze. For the first time, her face didn't register irritation or defensiveness. It registered offense, pure, immediate, and incandescent. "Did you just say victim?" she asked, each syllable honed into something sharp enough to cut. Diane's expression didn't change. "I use the word because it's the word people use. I'm asking whether you think it's possible for someone to be hurt and still have responsibilities." Meghan leaned back as if the chair itself had betrayed her. "You're doing it," she said. "You're doing the thing, Diane." "Which thing?" Diane asked. Meghan's eyes widened, incredulous, the subtle undermining, the reasonable tone. "The way you make the question sound neutral when it's actually loaded." Diane's voice stayed calm. "Again, I'm not trying to know." Meghan cut in louder now. You are. And you know exactly how this works." Her voice sharpened, urgency breaking through restraint. "You smile with your eyes. You speak like it's compassion. But what you're doing is gaslighting." The word hit the room like a plate shattering against the floor. Diane's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in anger, in surprise. "I'm not gaslighting you." Meghan leaned forward again, her movements sudden, forceful. "You're telling me my reality is inconsistent? That my story is contradictory? And now you're saying responsibility belongs to me in the same breath that you use the language of victimhood." Diane's voice remained low, measured. "Ain't never said your reality wasn't real. I said clarity matters." Meghan's hands opened, palms up, then closed into fists. "Clarity for who?" "For the public," Diane said. Meghan let out a short, sharp laugh. "Ah, there it is." Diane held her gaze. "People can empathize and still ask questions." "Not like this," Meghan snapped. "How then?" Diane asked. "With respect," Meghan said instantly. Diane nodded slowly. "I believe I have been respectful." Meghan's tone turned icy. "Respect isn't just manners. Respect is believing someone when they tell you they were hurt." "I do believe you were hurt," Diane said. "Then stop treating it like a logic puzzle," Meghan shot back. Diane's face tightened just slightly, still controlled. "This isn't a puzzle. It's an interview." Meghan stared at her, breathing quicker now, the edges of her composure beginning to fray. "No," This is a performance. Diane's voice softened. Meghan, no. Meghan cut her off, the politeness gone completely. I'm not going to sit here and be made into a headline. I'm not making you into a headline, Diane said. Meghan pointed not aggressively, but unmistakably. Yes, you are. And you're doing it with the tone that makes people believe. You're the reasonable one, no matter what I say. Diane's eyes narrowed in focus, not hostility. Then say what you want to say, clearly right now. No framing, no layers, just your words. The invitation was simple. Direct. It should have lowered the temperature. It didn't. Meghan took it as permission. She sat up straighter, shoulders squared, voice crisp and cutting. When she spoke, it was as if she were addressing someone who had been quietly taking notes on her life for years. Fine, she said. Here's what I want to say. She looked directly at Diane, unblinking. You don't get to ask me to prove my pain. Diane began to respond, but Meghan raised her hand. No, let me finish. The room shifted. The space felt suddenly claimed. You don't get to tell me my truth needs clarity, so strangers can feel comfortable consuming it, Meghan continued. Diane's mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't interrupt, and you don't get to. Sit there with a notebook, Meghan said, her voice sharpening further. Like the person who lived it is less credible than the person who writes it down. Diane's eyes remained steady. I'm listening. You're collecting, Meghan snapped. That's your interpretation, Diane replied. Because that's what it is, Meghan said. A beat passed. Then Diane said something that wasn't. Cruel but was firm enough to tilt the entire exchange. Meghan, you are not powerless in this room. Meghan went completely still. Say that again, she said quietly. Diane didn't hesitate. You are not powerless in this room. Air seemed to thicken. That sentence, so simple, so carefully stated, was the wrong one, because Meghan had built her entire stance on a sacred foundation. That she had been unheard, unsupported, cornered by institutions, denied agency. That her voice had been taken, minimized, overwritten, and now, Diane Sawyer, come professional. Unshaken, had just removed that foundation with a single sentence. Meghan's eyes flickered, searching, recalibrating. You think because I'm sitting here, because there are cameras, that means I have power? I think, Diane said carefully, that power can coexist with pain. Meghan shook her head slowly, disbelief curdling into something colder. That's the problem. You don't understand. Help me understand, Diane said. I didn't choose this position, Meghan said. I was pushed into it. Now you occupy it, Diane replied. The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was brittle. Meghan's breathing steadied, but her expression had changed. The anger was still there, but beneath it was something else, something closer to exposure. You keep saying I'm not powerless, Meghan said. But this entire conversation proves the opposite. How? Diane asked. Because no matter what I say, Meghan replied, it gets weighed, parsed, evaluated, against standards I never agreed to. Diane nodded once. That's what happens when stories become public. Meghan looked at her then, really looked at her, and something hardened. Then maybe, she said quietly, the price of being heard is too high. Diane didn't argue. She simply held the space. Knowing that the interview had crossed from conversation into collision, and that there was no way back to neutrality now. The rupture wasn't loud, but it was complete.